Something subtle is happening beneath the surface of your life. Not chaos, not confusion, just a quiet shift you can't quite explain. Decisions feel lighter. Attachments loosen without effort. Things you once defended no longer demand your energy. To the logical mind, this can feel strange, almost like you're losing interest in your own story. But you're not drifting. You're transitioning. What you're experiencing is the early phase of an energetic threshold connected to 2026, a year one in numerology. A year of initiation. A reset of identity. A quantum beginning. And contrary to what most people expect, year one doesn't begin with action. It begins with subtraction. Before anything new can take form, what no longer belongs must quietly dissolve. That's why this shift feels internal first. You're not unmotivated or off track. You're completing an old energetic agreement. A version of you that once made sense is naturally losing fuel. This is what a quantum rebirth looks like when it starts at the level of identity, long before life visibly rearranges itself. Most people assume transformation arrives with noise, breakdowns, endings, dramatic turning points. But the deepest changes are almost silent. Energy withdraws from outdated patterns. Your nervous system stops feeding roles, ambitions, fears, and relationships that no longer match who you're becoming. Your attention drifts away from timelines that once defined you. Nothing is breaking. Something is finishing. That's also why 2026 already feels different, even though it hasn't arrived yet. In the quantum field, time doesn't move in straight lines. Identity shifts first. Reality follows. What you're sensing isn't a prediction, it's preparation. The field initiates change the moment your internal frequency can no longer sustain the old version of you. Neurologically, this phase often shows up as reduced attachment to dopamine-driven goals. The brain begins prioritizing coherence over stimulation. Chasing outcomes loses its appeal. Alignment becomes everything. Quantum-wise, this is the moment the observer releases an outdated identity, allowing the probabilities attached to it to collapse. And spiritually, this phase has always had a name. The void. The space between who you were and who you are remembering yourself to be. The void is uncomfortable not because it is empty, but because it is undefined. The mind wants certainty. It wants labels. It wants timelines. But rebirth does not offer those things up front. Rebirth offers silence, and silence feels threatening to an identity that learned to survive through noise, effort, and constant self-defin. That's why many people misinterpret this phase as losing direction, when in truth, direction is being recalibrated at a level deeper than thought. If you felt less reactive, less attached, less interested in explaining yourself, that's not withdrawal. That's coherence. Forming. If you've noticed that old fears don't hook you the same way, but new clarity hasn't fully arrived yet, that's not confusion. That's the old identity dissolving faster than the new one can fully stabilize. The quantum field is already responding to this shift. What feels like nothing happening is actually everything rearranging. Beneath perception, a quantum rebirth does not ask you to become someone new. It asks you to stop performing who you are not. And that's why it often begins with stillness. The field must clear. Before it can lock into a new signal, the nervous system must release hypervigilance before it can trust expansion. The mind must loosen its grip on identity before awareness can reorganize around truth. This is why forcing clarity right now will only create resistance. Rebirth cannot be rushed, not because it is slow, but because it is precise. The universe is not experimenting with you. It is recalibrating you. And recalibration feels subtle, internal, and almost invisible at first. You won't see fireworks. You'll feel space. You won't hear commands. You'll sense an internal enough of old cycles, old compromises, old versions of yourself that no longer fit. What's important to understand is this. When a rebirth begins, reality hasn't stalled. It has paused for accuracy. The field is waiting for your identity to fully release what it has outgrown so it can reorganize around what is emerging. That's why so many people feel like they're standing at a threshold right now, not moving forward, not moving backward, just standing. That standing is not inactivity, it's integration. And if you're feeling this, you're not alone, but you are early, Not everyone. Senses a rebirth before it becomes visible. Those who do are usually the ones whose identity is shifting first, before circumstances follow. 2026 doesn't bring this rebirth. It reveals it. The process has already begun. In the next part, we're going to explore why 2026 is not just a new year, but a new frequency, and why your life will not respond to it the way it responded to any year before. What you're sensing about 2026 has very little to do with time and everything to do with frequency. The human mind is trained to see years as milestones, as pages on a calendar that flip and magically reset life. But reality does not reorganize itself by dates. It reorganizes itself by coherence. And when coherence reaches a critical threshold, entire timelines begin to restructure quietly, methodically, and often long before the external world reflects the shift. This is why 2026 already feels present, not emotionally, but energetically. You're not anticipating it. You're tuning into it. In quantum terms, the future is not something you move toward. It's something you resonate with. When enough internal conditions align, the nervous system, the brain, and the energetic field begin to synchronize with a new baseline. That baseline doesn't announce itself as excitement. It feels more like inevitability, like something that no longer needs to be questioned. From a scientific perspective, this kind of shift mirrors what happens when complex systems reach a phase transition. Water doesn't slowly become ice. It reaches a precise temperature, and then its entire structure reorganizes instantly. Consciousness works the same way. Identity accumulates small changes over time, but transformation happens when a threshold is crossed. 2026 represents that threshold, not because of astrology or symbolism, but because a collective, an individual recalibration has been building beneath awareness for years. Neuroscience supports this. When the brain undergoes long-term identity change, it doesn't happen through constant stimulation or motivation. It happens through repetition, disengagement from outdated reward loops, and the gradual strengthening of new neural pathways. Many people are experiencing this now as a loss of interest in old pursuits, old definitions of success, old emotional reactions. Not because something is wrong, but because the brain is conserving energy for a more coherent identity. It's preparing to stabilize a new frequency. Spiritually, this phase has always been understood as a passage, rather than a beginning. Ancient traditions never marked rebirth by dates alone. They marked it by readiness. Readiness is not excitement. It's clarity without explanation. It's the sense that something is aligning without needing permission from logic. When readiness appears, time becomes secondary. The field responds to readiness immediately, even if the physical manifestation unfolds gradually. This is why 2026 feels different from previous new chapters in your life. Those were changes you initiated consciously. This one feels like it's initiating you. You're not choosing it. It's choosing you. And that distinction matters. Conscious change requires effort. Quantum change requires surrender. The more you try to define what's coming, the more friction you create. The field doesn't respond to planning at this level. It responds to availability. Availability means your identity is no longer clinging to what it has outgrown. It means your nervous system is learning to remain calm without needing certainty. It means your mind is loosening its grip on control in favor of coherence. This is not passive. It's deeply intelligent. The body knows when a higher frequency identity is approaching, and it begins to release what would interfere with sustaining it. That's why forcing goals right now feels exhausting. That's why some ambitions feel hollow, even if they once motivated you deeply. That's why your intuition feels louder than your logic. You're not losing direction. You're exiting an outdated frequency. And when an old frequency collapses, the field clears space for a new one to stabilize. 2026 is not arriving to disrupt your life. It's arriving to confirm a shift that is already underway. The reason it feels inevitable is Because at an energetic level, it is. The field has already adjusted. Your consciousness has already begun. Recalibrating. What remains is integration, allowing the new frequency to settle into your daily state without resistance. This is where many people struggle. They sense the change, but they try to rush clarity. They demand certainty before coherence is fully stabilized. They try to label what is still forming. But rebirth doesn't respond to interrogation. It responds to permission. Permission to let the old identity dissolve without needing to immediately replace it. Permission to exist in transition without interpreting it as failure or delay. If you allow this frequency to integrate naturally, you'll notice something subtle but powerful. Your life will begin responding differently to you. Less friction, more precision, fewer forced decisions, more intuitive alignment. Reality will feel less reactive and more responsive. Not because you're doing more, but because you're finally operating from a frequency that matches where the field is already moving. And this is only the beginning of the rebirth. In the next part, we'll explore why the old identity must dissolve before the new one appears, and why this empty space is not a problem, but the most important phase of all. Every rebirth begins with a disappearance. Not the dramatic kind people talk about, but a quieter one. The slow fading of an identity that no longer has energy feeding it. This is the part most people misunderstand and fear. They think rebirth means becoming someone new when, in reality, it begins by no longer being who you were. And this phase almost never feels empowering at first. It feels empty, neutral, disorienting, like standing in a room after all the furniture has been removed before anything new has been brought in. This is not regression. It is not loss of purpose. It is not you falling behind. It is the quantum collapse of an identity that can no longer be sustained by your current frequency. The field responds first to what you stop energizing. When an old version of you loses coherence, the probabilities tied to that version dissolve. Relationships shift, motivations weaken, old fears lose their grip. Even desires that wants to find you begin to feel strangely irrelevant. This is not because something is missing. It's because something is completing. From a neurological standpoint, this phase is marked by disengagement from old reward loops. The brain no longer receives the same dopamine response from achievements, validation, or familiar struggles. What once felt motivating now feels hollow. This can be unsettling because the mind interprets loss of stimulation as loss of meaning. But meaning is not disappearing. It's being rewritten at a deeper level. The brain is conserving energy, redirecting it toward the stabilization of a new identity that has not fully emerged yet. Spiritually, this phase has always been described as a form of death, not physical but symbolic. The ego dissolves roles it once needed to survive. The self-image loosens. You stop needing to explain yourself the way you used to. You stop fighting battles that once felt essential. And most importantly, you stop reacting to life the same way. This is often mistaken for apathy when it is actually neutrality. The nervous system exiting survival mode and preparing for coherence. This is why this stage can feel lonely even when nothing has changed externally. You're no longer vibrating at the same frequency as your old environment, but the new environment hasn't fully materialized yet. You're between timelines, and in that space the mind wants to rush clarity. It wants to label the future, define the next chapter, replace the old identity immediately. But quantum rebirth doesn't allow shortcuts. If the old identity hasn't fully dissolved, the new one cannot stabilize. Any attempt to force reinvention at this stage only recreates the past in a different costume. The field is precise. It waits for completion before expansion. And completion requires stillness. This is why doing nothing right now feels strangely productive. Even if the mind resists it, your consciousness is withdrawing energy from outdated structures so the field can reorganize around what is emerging. The more you try to cling to the old self for Certainty, the longer the transition. Feels, the moment you allow the old identity to dissolve without panic. The rebirth accelerates naturally. Many people abandon the process here. They mistake the void for failure. They assume something went wrong. They return to old patterns simply because they are familiar, not because they are aligned. But those who stay, those who allow the identity death to complete, emerge with a level of clarity and coherence that cannot be forced. The new self does not arrive as an idea. It arrives as a state, a way of moving through life that feels grounded, calm, precise, and undeniably true. If you're experiencing moments of emotional flatness mixed with sudden clarity or detachment mixed with deep inner knowing, this is why the old self is no longer running the system. But the new one hasn't fully taken the controls yet. You're not lost. You're unoccupied. And that openness is exactly what allows the quantum field to recalibrate your trajectory without interference. The most important thing to understand is this: nothing real is being taken from you. Everything that is dissolving was sustained by a version of you that you have already outgrown. The field is not stripping you. It is freeing you. And the space that feels uncomfortable now is the same space that will soon hold a more coherent, powerful, and authentic version of your life. In the next part, we're going to explore why rebirth is not about becoming someone new, but remembering who you are and how to anchor that remembrance so it doesn't fade once life speeds up again. A true rebirth is never about construction. It is about remembrance. The mind believes change means adding something. New habits, new goals, new identities, new labels. But the quantum field doesn't respond to what you add. It responds to what you uncover. What you're experiencing right now is not the creation of a new self, but the removal of layers that were never truly you. The rebirth feels subtle because truth does not need force. It settles. It aligns. It stabilizes. This is why, as the old identity dissolves, the new one does not arrive with effort. It arrives with recognition. There is a quiet sense of this feels right that does not need explanation. A clarity that doesn't demand urgency. A groundedness that doesn't depend on circumstances. This is the signature of remembrance. The moment your consciousness realigns with a version of you that existed before conditioning, before survival strategies, before you learn to perform for safety. From a quantum perspective, remembrance is coherence. It is the moment your internal signal becomes clean again. When you stop broadcasting fragmented identities, the field responds with precision. Your life begins to reorganize around simplicity instead of struggle. Decisions become clearer not because you know more, but because you are no longer split internally. Action feels natural instead of forced. Rest feels deserved instead of earned. And creation begins flowing from alignment, not effort. Spiritually, this stage has always been honored through ritual, reflection, and intentional anchoring. Not to create change, but to hold it. This is where many rebirths fail. Not because the awakening wasn't real, but because it wasn't stabilized. Life speeds up again. Old environments return. External pressure increases. And without anchoring, the nervous system reverts to familiar patterns. The rebirth fades not because it was false, but because it wasn't integrated. This is why rebirth requires practice, not motivation. It requires a way to consistently return to coherence, to document your internal shifts, to work consciously with language, intention, and presence. Writing is not just expression. It is neural encoding. Symbolic practices are not superstition. They are tools that communicate directly with the subconscious and the field. When used intentionally, they train your identity to stay aligned even as reality begins to move faster around you. A quantum rebirth that is not anchored becomes a memory. A quantum rebirth that is integrated becomes a new baseline, and 2026 is not asking you to awaken. That has already begun. It is asking you to stabilize who you are becoming so the field can build around you without collapse. This is the difference between a temporary shift and a permanent transformation. If you feel this rebirth Unfolding, the most important question. Now is not what's next, but how do I hold this frequency? How do you move through daily life without abandoning the clarity you've accessed? How do you translate subtle awareness into embodied presence? How do you keep remembering who you are when the noise returns? This is exactly why I created Quantum Rebirth 2026. Not as motivation, not as theory, but as a structured initiation into this phase. You are already entering Quantum Rebirth 2026 is an ebook designed to guide you through the internal transition that happens when an old identity collapses and a new frequency begins to stabilize. It walks you through the rebirth process, step by step, helping you understand what is happening psychologically, neurologically, and energetically so you don't misinterpret this phase or abandon it halfway through. It's meant to bring clarity, grounding, and direction during a moment that often feels silent and undefined. Alongside it comes the quantum grimoire, not as something mystical in the fantasy sense, but as a practical tool for anchoring identity shifts. The grimoire exists to help you encode intention, stabilize coherence, and work consciously with your inner state through writing, reflection, and symbolic practice. This is how rebirth stops being an experience and becomes a baseline. This is how the nervous system learns to hold the new frequency instead of reverting to the old one. Together, they are not about manifesting more things. They are about becoming stable in who you are becoming. So, reality can reorganize around you without resistance. They are meant for this exact phase when you are no longer who you were but not fully embodied as who you are yet. If you recognize yourself in this moment, if this rebirth feels familiar rather than exciting, then these tools were created for you. You don't need to rush. Just feel into it. You are not trying to change your life. Your life is already changing, and now you are simply learning how to hold